Richard, let's start with Fareed Zakaria's report on CNN. He's claiming that global tides are turning against autocracy. Explaining this to us, if that's the fact on the ground right now, how did you find the presidential debate as well? I want to know about that as well. And let's get started.
Yeah, I find Fareed Zakaria a little bit like President Biden. Mostly my reaction is sadness. In the case of Biden, that his age and his infirmities are catching up to him. And in the case of Fareed, that his desperate desire to find something to feel positive about are catching up with him. I don't think either of them understands, or if they do, is willing to face or admit their problem. And that is that their politics, the kind of political ideas that they have committed their whole lives to, are declining. And this is very depressing. I understand the depressing feeling of that. If you've been on the left for most of the last 50, 60 years, you have been forced to face that kind of a sense of decline, a sense of doom. And it is not enjoyable. It is not uplifting. It is depressing. There's no better word for it. And I think Mr. Biden and Mr. Zakaria are depressed. And they are looking for something, hopefully, to believe in. And maybe they'll find it. I don't see it, but maybe they'll find it. I'm not looking for it. They are, so maybe they will. But let me tell you what the signs are that they are not facing. And I can start today with the election results last Sunday in France. Okay, let's be sure we understand the importance. The leader in France, Emmanuel Macron, was a middle-of-the-road, enthusiastic, pro-capitalist leader. He had flirted a little bit with center-left politics. He held a position in a socialist government some years ago. He clearly flirted with a center-right position. Most of his policies, since he won a strange election that made him president. But whatever you think of him, he was enthusiastic about pursuing the war in Ukraine against Russia. He was enthusiastic about supporting Israel in Gaza. And he was enthusiastic about protecting and strengthening the capitalist system in France. And the French people responded to these commitments by throwing him out of office. He received just over 20% of the vote last Sunday in France, which means that 4 out of 5 French voters do not want him in office. By far, the most harsh commentary on center-of-the-road, routine capitalism of the last 50 years. Mr. Trump represents a similar rejection of the old system in the United States. Mr. Starmer, a weak character, still in all represents, in the overwhelming defeat he is about to enjoy over the Conservative Party, which is going to be voted out of office as totally as Macron was in France later this week. So you can see why Fareed Zakaria is depressed. His notion of what the West represents is going down everywhere, with very few exceptions. Okay, number one. Now, number two. Nothing is new about what Fareed Zakaria wants to say. He basically is saying there that the mass of people are depressed and that he wants to give them some of his own optimism. But he ought to begin by asking, why are they depressed? And the answer is overwhelmingly that their economic situation is bad. If they live in a Western European style social democracy, they are seeing it reduced every year. Services taken away, taxes increased. I mean, for example, the entire Yellow Vest movement in France, which was the beginning of the end for Mr. Macron anyway, was a response to his trying to persuade the French public to improve their environmental situation by paying a tax on fuel. And they said, we favor ecological improvement, but not at our expense. And he didn't get it. He didn't understand what they were telling him. Fareed Zakaria doesn't want people to think about their economic reality. He wants them to think about values, he calls them. Values. Now, that takes a lot of nerve. What values is he talking about? Well, he says autocracy versus democracy. Okay? Autocracy. Russia, he claims, is autocratic. But they now allow more diversity in Russia than Mr. Zelensky allows in the Ukraine. Israel may be democratic, whatever that means, inside Israel, but it is extremely autocratic in Gaza and in the West Bank. And here in the United States, what are we talking about? Every major part of our economy is governed by large corporations. The majority of our people are either employees of those corporations or dependent upon those corporations in some other way. How are those corporations organized? Answer: autocratically. The CEO of a corporation is not a Democrat. The workers there don't elect this person. They have no power over them. The CEO can fire them, right? 10% of our workers are represented by a union and have a contract that gives them some protection for their job and their income. The other 90% of American workers depend on an autocratic economic system. And that autocratic system is hurting them in recent years by inflation, by job conditions, by depriving them of benefits of various kinds. So For the mass of people, of course, they're not excited about the difference between autocracy and democracy, because economically they live in an autocracy, and politically the same autocrats buy the political system, and everybody knows it. So what is Mr. Zachariah talking about? Well, you know, it's very old. Long ago, those who defend capitalism knew they had very little economic argument. So they tried to make their argument about politics. So the left is dictatorial, it used to be said, whereas capitalism is democratic. Okay, maybe that worked for a while when the socialist world was very poor, and you could fool people into thinking that capitalism made you well off and socialism made you poor. And there are those who still try that. But it doesn't work, because the most rapidly growing economic wealth is in China. And China is a socialist economy. So the argument doesn't work very well, which is why it is not succeeding very well. And that is why what Fareed Zakaria is trying to do is to resuscitate, to revive an old argument. Working class people, please look at the form of government. Don't look at your daily job conditions. Don't look at the daily reality you face, which is your political leaders are light years from you and anything you can control. It's not going to work. It hasn't worked now for years, which is why Fareed Zakaria is depressed. But because he doesn't ask these questions, he doesn't face these realities, he'll keep giving the same advice. It reminds me of nothing so much as recent months when the spokespeople for the Biden administration have told us over and over again, the American economy is in good shape, but the mass of the voters don't think the American economy is in good shape. And so the question is, what's the matter with them? Why are they ignorant? Why don't they see? And my answer to them has been, they're not ignorant and they see perfectly clearly, but they don't see what you see. Or to be more accurate, you don't see where they live. You live in the world of the top 10%, the ones who own 80% of the shares in the stock market. The stock market is doing nicely. The top 10% are doing nicely. But the mass of the people are not doing nicely. They aren't ignorant. They aren't stupid. They are in a different situation. And you are losing their support. That's what Mr. Trump represents. And that was the sad reality of watching Mr. Biden. The problem is not his age, and the problem is not his government. They are doing what democratic governments have always done. He represents the pretense that all is well, and that's what's defeating him. And Mr. Trump has the luxury of saying, all is not well, vote for me, I'll make it better. And the worst irony of all is that the reason Mr. Biden won the election last time is that he said to Trump then what Trump is saying to Biden now. This is a dead, old politics, and we're watching it painfully disintegrate. Goodbye, Macron. Goodbye, Sunak, goodbye, and we will have many more in the months and years ahead.
I've sent you an article in Bloomberg. It says that US company becomes world's most valuable solar firm after Chinese rival slip. We know that China produces most of these solar panels in the world, but how a US company can get to that level, in your opinion?
Very easy. And again, there is a sadness to the Bloomberg story. A United States company comes to number one. You know, for the last, I don't know, at least 10 years, that same company has not been number one. And it's very easy to explain what is going on. And Bloomberg knows what I'm about to explain to you. But for the moment, the statistic is correct, and they want to grab the moment, this pathetic game. So let's begin. China has devoted itself, logically, being the new up-and-coming economic power, to trying to identify where they have the best chance to outmaneuver the United States. And by the way, they don't do that just to be number one in the rankings of Bloomberg. They do that in the same way that, for example, after World War II, the rebuilding of the German, Japanese, and other economies had to face the fact that the dominant economy in the world after World War II was the United States. No bomb fell here after Pearl Harbor. And the big problem of unemployment of the 1930s was overcome by World War II, which put all Americans back to work. So America had a thriving capitalist economy in 1945, quickly dominating the world. And the only way capitalists in Germany defeated, Japan defeated, Britain and France not defeated, the only way they could come back was to look at the dominant player, US corporations, and figure out somehow, using their laboratories, their scientists, their managers, how to produce new or different or better or cheaper than the United States. That was the goal. And the Chinese, starting later, they didn't really get going until the 1980s, more or less, had the same issue. They had to do better than the United States or the Germans, Japanese, British, and French, and so on, because they had the same problem. And so they went to work. One of the areas they focused on was renewable energy, for the obvious reason that you would run out of oil eventually and gas. So renewable energy, everybody understood was important. And the Chinese, because of the way their economy is organized, they can concentrate, focus, private and public together to solve problems, which is something private enterprise economies like Britain and America have much harder time doing. So the Chinese chose, among other things, electric vehicles and solar panels, other things too. But I'm going to pick those two because they become very important. And within a few years, the Chinese figure out the best solar panels at the lowest price and the best electric vehicles at the lowest price. Okay. They then begin to sell it all over the world, and they dominate the markets in these commodities, among others. And they're doing more and more of that every day. They are very successful in this strategy. One of the ways the Chinese succeed is they give subsidies and supports to any business that goes into the areas that they prioritize, such as solar panels and electric vehicles. So, for example, they give lots of support and they have lots, I believe 60 or 70 solar panel companies, because they don't know which one will figure out the best way to make up and all of that. They know, because they have done this now many times. They know that 60 or 70 will sooner or later outproduce the market. There'll be too many. And those that are the least effective will go out of business. That repeats what happens in every industry. Many producers become few producers. In China, that's the process going on now. It's been going on for a few years. There is a process of oversupply of solar panels and many less efficient firms falling away, going out of business. That's a normal part of the development of private enterprise in China and everywhere else. The number one company, Lingo, it's a name like that. I don't pronounce the Chinese, but it's like that. The number one company in China has had particular troubles. It's not the most efficient, and it has been over the last 2 years cutting employment and cutting production. If you look at it, it went from being many times larger to the United States First Solar, the number one company in this country, from many times larger to being about the same size now. So the arrival of the American company to number one is not an achievement of the American company. It is the collapse of the number one Chinese company, coming all the way down to where the American company is. It was much bigger than the American company for most of the last few years. The Bloomberg table doesn't show you any of that. Who will replace the Chinese company that has come down? Others of the Chinese competitors who are in better shape will now get larger, replacing the position of the one that fell apart, right? If you understand anything about capitalist industry, this is the way this is normally done. But I'm not finished. Let's now look at the number one American company, First Solar. Right? It has Chinese companies that, again, were much larger and have come down to its size. And there are other Chinese companies roughly the same size. So it's ahead, it's the number one, but by this amount. And now the thing that should be in the forefront. One of the reasons First Solar is even in a position to do anything is because it got huge subsidies from the Biden administration. In fact, there are investigations going on right now because huge millions of dollars of donations by investors in First Solar went to Biden already back in 2020. And the Biden administration, when it passed the Fight Back to Inflation bill, one of its big bills, contained subsidies for solar panels, which went in the main to the First Solar Corporation. In other words, what you're watching is the subsidization of capitalist solar production in China and the catch-up subsidization of solar panel productions in the United States. This is not a victory for the United States. This is nothing that might be suggested by that Bloomberg table is honest. It's very sad. It's childish. The Chinese are beating us in all of these technologies, including solar panels. They have much bigger production than we do. And as I've just given you the particular history of those companies, the biggest one in China and the biggest one here, you will begin to understand that the situation cannot be read as some sort of arrival of the United States at a position of dominance. It has no such dominance. It never had that dominance in solar panels. And I could, of course, tell you pretty much the same about electric vehicles, but I won't because it repeats the same story. Americans, like Bloomberg, are desperate. You have to be desperate to make a table like that and then have a headline and hope that your readers feel better because an American company is number one, and you don't tell them the story, which, by the way, in other available sources, everybody can learn. I'm not relying on anything that is special. The information I gave you about the Chinese company and about the First Solar here, the US company, is information I got from sources like Bloomberg, among others. They have them, I have them, but what you're seeing is an example of the denial that Americans are engaged in because they do not want to face the decline of their system and their empire.
Richard, we in this election in France, we have two parties above Macron's party. The first party is a right-wing party. The second is a left-wing party. And how do you see that these two parties coming above the Macron's party? Could you expand on what's going on right now in Europe?
Yes, let me focus first on France because too many people know too little about what's going on there. Okay, first of all, on the right-wing party, the rally, the national rally, the national grouping under Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, it got about 34% of the vote, so about a third. On the left, there was a coming together of four political parties who have not been very unified until recently and have had many struggles amongst each other. But it's important for people to understand who the four parties were. So, number one, and the leader, is called France Unbowed, France Insoumise, which literally means France not subordinated, unsubordinated. Insoumise is what it means. And their leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This is a socialist party, very openly and very affirmatively, enthusiastically. And they are the largest party. Then comes the French Communist Party, which has been the same Communist Party for many, many decades. Number three, the French Socialist Party, once very large, now small. And number four, the French Green Party. Those four parties came together and formed the New Popular Front, which is a reference to a similar unification of the left back in the 1930s, which was also called itself the Popular Front. It is very important that these left-wing parties could get together and overcome their differences. It is very important that the efforts of the Macron government, public and also under the table by police and intelligence, internal, to disrupt and keep them fighting each other, that failed. They came together, okay? They got 28% of the vote, not much less than the right wing. And Mr. Macron, the sitting president, got about 20% of the vote. In other words, 4 out of 5 French voters want Mr. Macron gone. That is an amazing statement for a centrist president of one of the 4 major economies in Europe, Britain, France, Spain, and Italy, the 4 big ones. He was enthusiastically for the war in Ukraine against Russia. He's gone. He was a big supporter of Israel. He's gone. The people of France, look what they have told you. And then they're almost split between whether to go left or whether to go right. The only thing they really all agree on is get rid of Mr. Macron. If we had in the United States against Trump on the right, Bernie Sanders or someone like him on the left, Mr. Biden would be looking at us the way Mr. Macron is looking at the French people. As he says, goodbye, I'm gone, I am finished. That's very important to understand. For the left everywhere, here's what's important to understand. Don't be disunified. It makes you weak and ineffective. Understand that if you get all of the potential left-wingers together, you can win political power. Okay? 6% of the French voters is all that. If 3% leave the right and go to the left, we have a different outcome. And in the second, next week, next Sunday, when the second vote in France happens, the question will be, what will the 20% who voted for Macron, what will they do confronted with what they're going to see? Okay. The next thing that has to be understood, and I know this is difficult, but you know, you asked the right questions, so I'm going to give you what I think is the right answer. None of the 3, not Macron, not Le Pen, and even not Mélenchon, have a solution. They haven't put one forward. Mr. Macron lost this election because he's the man in charge, and he is obviously unable to do anything to change the basic problems French people face. That's why they voted against him. Now, what does the right wing propose? Very strange. They want to get rid of immigrants, but immigrants are not France's problem. Whether you keep them or send them home or keep some of them, you're not changing the basic problems of the French economy. This is silly. You're misunderstanding. That's a useful scapegoat that enabled the right wing to get voters because they are at least saying something. The situation is terrible, so we are going to put the burden of a bad situation on those poor immigrants from Africa, North Africa, South Africa, the ones that come to France. And for the French people, and I don't admire this, but for the French people, okay, so that's less burden on us, more burden on them. We'll support that. It helps us a little. But even the French people kind of know this is, and what else are you going to do? Okay, you're going to maybe stop the war in Ukraine, or at least pull the French out of it. But he's not going to change the basic conditions of France either, and they know that. And the same is true about whatever happens in Gaza. They know. So what? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing there. There's a clever phrase in the United States now that I can use. When you're looking for something, you're hungry for something, and instead you get what is called a nothing burger. 2 pieces of bread, and in between, nothing. It's a disappointment. So if you elect Le Pen, you will have a government that will disappoint the French people. After whatever euphoria, after they do something really ugly to poor immigrants, they will not solve the problem. Now let's turn to Mr. Mélenchon. He doesn't have a solution either. What are you going to do? Raise taxes somewhat on the corporations? Sure. Raise wages? Good. Improve the pensions of French workers? Nice. That's not going to solve the problems of French capitalism. You know, the reaction of French businesses will be to leave if they can, to cut back, to wage an economic version of guerrilla war against these liberal left-wingers. We know that. That's what they do. So what is the left going to do? They're going to make the conditions worse. People are going to sell stocks on the shares on the French stock market and buy instead in the New York stock market. What's the plan? What are you going to do? What is your program that could solve the problem of the French economy that has accumulated over the last 75 years of post-World War II capitalism? They're afraid, some of them, because I know some of them, they have some plans, but they're afraid. If they say them, if they try to implement them, there will be such a reaction that they will be defeated. And my answer to them is, if you don't do it, I assure you, you will be defeated. Because you know what will happen? You'll get a right wing replacing Macron. It will fail. Then there will be turned to the left wing. Bring them in. But then when they fail, you know what? Mr. Macron or another zero like him will reemerge, and and people will turn to him, not because they believe it, but because they know that the right wing and the left wing have just failed. Just like they knew this Sunday that Macron was a failure, and they're trying something else. Therefore, for me, here's the message. Western capitalism, this private enterprise dominated system of factories, offices, and stores in which a tiny group of wealthy, powerful people make all the basic decisions. We all know how it works because we all live and work in that system. That's the problem. You've got to come up with an alternative and a plan to achieve it, or else you will not solve the problems of this system. That's what election should teach you. And my hope is that the left wing will get the idea. Unity, organization and ideology for unity, but also unity around a real program. You will eventually the left will be the political power to which the voters will eventually turn. They will turn away from a Macron and they will try a right wing for sure. But when that is as failed as, look, after 4 years of Trump, America voted for Biden. After 4 years of Biden, they look like they're going to vote for Trump. This is crazy. Biden is too old at 82, but Mr. Trump at 78 it's childish. Scapegoating the age, scapegoating the immigrant, these are all desperate efforts not to face the structural problem that capitalism, particularly the private version we have in the West, can no longer do what it did. It is not winning the competition, it's losing it. China is showing us that the hybrid, this mixture of half government-owned and operated enterprises, half private enterprises, both of them managed and controlled by a development-focused communist party, is a better system. It can grow better. And you either deal with that or you pretend it's not happening, or like Fareed Zakaria, you somehow tell yourself, we are democratic and they are authoritarian, and that's what everybody should please pay attention to, even though it doesn't work and it isn't true and it misses the whole basic issue for the mass of people. And I don't think, therefore, I say this as a fellow podcaster with Fareed Zakaria, I advise him to change his message because his audience is going to leave.
Yeah. You know that Modi, in his first visit after his election, he's going to be in Russia. We know how the West is convincing India not to be so close to Russia or China. How's that working, in your opinion, on the part of the Western mindset?
Well, the way I would answer it is to tell you that when I was a graduate student getting my PhD in economics, I took a course in economic development, it was called. And one of the topics that our professor stressed was what he referred to, and this is the 1960s, was the competition between India and China to develop. These were both huge countries, both Asian countries, both very poor countries, and their overwhelming goal was to stop being poor. And I remember the importance the professor gave to telling us that this would be an important lesson for the world because one country was communist, that was the language used then, and the other one was democratic. That was what language they used. I remember trying to explain to my professor that what China had was a communist party, but that China did not think of itself as a communist economy, just like the Soviet Union never did. That this was a Western choice of language, which was very confusing to people because it didn't understand that they thought they were socialists. But I got the idea. And I said to him equally, India, democratic, I mean, the majority of people in India have one overwhelming worry. Will they be alive tomorrow? This is the poverty there is it's bad in China, but it's even worse in India. Well, we've had the experiment now for half a century, and China is here and India is here. I don't want to take away from what India has accomplished. It has developed, but it has left the majority of its people out of that development. They are as poor almost now as they were 50 years ago. And that is not the case in China, or at the very least, a much larger percentage. I mean, China is now what it is. It is the great power confronting the United States. India is an important country, but it's not China. That competition is over. May start up again, but it's over. That's the first thing I would say. Number two, notice communist versus democratic in 1960. And here we are 70 years later, and Fareed Zakaria is giving us authoritarian and democratic. This is the same old story. It's not going to work. It didn't work all that well then, and it sure as hell is not going to work now. And Mr. Modi is clearly, and even in a number of commentaries in the West, considered authoritarian, even though the Americans still hope that because the ruling party in India is not the Indian Communist Party, or I should say, one of the several Indian Communist parties, it isn't. Those parties remain significant but small. In China, the Communist Party has remained in power. And so that alone, given America's ideological, they have hopes for India that they have given up for China. So my guess is they are now focusing as best they can on trying to come up with some plan to separate India from China and from Russia. And so far, it looks like a big failure, like so many of their policies. India helped Russia out of the sanctions problem from the West. That was an enormous service. Russia has, for a very long time, been very supportive of India in many ways, providing money, providing weapons, all kinds of stuff. Even when India used the weapons against Russia's ally China on their border and so forth, there are tensions among them. But I don't think it's not fair to call Mr. Lula in Brazil an authoritarian. There's really, Americans do these things because they need these disagreement. They need to make the United States and the G7 good and BRICS bad, so they lump them all together. But the truth is, and it's always been this way, that for every authoritarian regime in one, I'll find you one here. Most Latin American governments are very authoritarian, whoever they are. And even when the left wins, it tends to replicate much of that. And you have that in Venezuela, and you had that a little bit in Cuba, and so on. And so I find the whole thing really pretty much beside the point. The ease with which bin Salman, the head of Saudi Arabia, can be in the West on one day and in the BRICS on the next day suggests to you that the issue is not how authoritarian the government is or isn't. That is public relations for naive people to consume. But for the rest of the world, no, they pretty much understand. By the way, Vietnam and Thailand have also now indicated their interest in joining the BRICS. Look, the BRICS is now, even before Malaysia or Turkey, just take the existing 11 countries that make up the BRICS. That is the biggest, richest conglomerate in the world economy. It is now significantly richer than the G7, the United States. It means that every country on earth has to rethink, where are you making alliances? Where are you borrowing money? Who are you inviting to invest in your country? Where are you looking to source inputs, imports? Where are you looking to sell? You better understand. If you sell, I'll give you an example. If you sell bananas and you're not in BRICS, but there's another country that sells bananas that is in BRICS, whose bananas are going to be purchased by the BRICS? You don't want to be left out. You can't. You have to come to some relationship, even if you want to hold on to your links to the West with this. Otherwise, you are going to be destroyed. So what the countries are doing is beginning to figure out how to play the G7 against the BRICS and vice versa if you're not in either of them. And if you can't do that, you better join. And then who do you join? You join the bigger. The BRICS are beginning to accumulate all of the advantages that the United States used to have. Nobody should be surprised, least of all the United States. What did you expect? That you would always be the dominant? There's never been every empire that rose fell. Every hegemon that rose fell. You really think you're the exception? Stop. It's childish. It's not a reasonable object. And you're watching the shift. Everybody is shifting their positions. And the authoritarian versus democratic, that's an interesting question, but that's being fought out inside every country, just like it's being fought out in some way inside every enterprise. The reason you see a growing interest around the world in cooperative enterprises, in worker co-ops and other kinds of is precisely that masses of people, they don't want the authoritarian political, but they don't want it in their workplace either. And so can they, will they, might they? Yes. How, at what rate, who knows? But that's everywhere. That's the immediate reality that is explaining the decline of the West. And they're not going to save themselves by pretending a democracy they don't have and distinguishing it from the autocracy, which is beside the point, because what China offers the world is not a political model, but an economic model. That's the power of what attracts people to China. They want that economic growth. They want that global prestige and recognition. Of course they do. That's what the United States wanted when it stopped being a colony of Great Britain. It wanted to develop its own, the ability to forget when it's convenient is not an admirable quality.
Yeah. Richard, just to wrap up this session, beside that Belt and Road Initiative that we talked about it before, we have a project among Iran, Russia, and India, North-South transportation corridor that comes from Russia to Azerbaijan, Iran, then India. It's huge. It's huge when you look at the details. It just reduces 40 to 60% the price of transportation. That's why I think that they cannot separate India from Russia, because they have a lot in common right now. Europe is the biggest loser of this conflict right now, but it doesn't seem that they understand it.
No. Well, first, let me comment on that transportation corridor. It reminds me of nothing so much as the building of railroads in the United States. This country went from very poor, very backward, small, distant colony of Britain into a powerhouse. And nothing was more, there were many factors, but nothing was more important than building a rail system from the coast into the interior, making it possible to link the two oceans, making it possible to cheapen the time and the cost of transportation. It meant you could open up the vast middle to produce food for the world, which it still does, wheat and corn and all the rest of it. And that's what's happened. And it created the United States. It made it one country. It made it possible for people to move, to live in all those places that before had been left to the indigenous people, who were, of course, eliminated. What you see now should strike Americans as the logic. The Russians, the Iranians, the Indians, they are doing exactly what they should be doing, heavily investing in the means by which to link their economies, to give themselves opportunities to trade that are much more attractive, cheaper, faster. I mean, so it opens up economic possibilities. And yeah, the Europeans are the ones that are going to be losing in the competition that this opens. But that's their own fault. It's the fault of the Europeans in two ways. Number one, they could not overcome their divisions, their different languages, their different histories, their different, and become unified enough, right? The irony is the Polish people, the Irish people, the Italian people, the Hungarian people left those countries, went to the United States, and overcame all those differences. But back home, they didn't do it. And the second failure is they could have been participants and partners, just as the Chinese are participating with the Belt and Road and with that corridor. So you want to be part of this. If you don't want it to be used against you, then you have to make a contribution. You have to make a commitment. You have to connect your rail system to this one, your transportation options and ports. You have to integrate. They didn't do it. They're fighting a dead old Cold War, revived now. So they've made Russia, instead of a partner, an enemy. Putin years ago said, we'll be your partner. Let's open up Russia, biggest country on earth by geography. We need development. You Europeans can help us. No. Instead, they pushed NATO up against the Russians, making them fearful, rightly, and enemies, understandably. And so now they're going to be left out. You're right. And we're going to have a growing competition led by a heavily invested East, Russia and East, and the United States, or what's left of it. And the Europeans are going to be, at best, secondary junior partners of the United States. And that they will be the first sacrificed in any difficulties between the United States and the Chinese and Russian Indian colossus. And I understand why Mr. Modi, whatever his political objectives, he's looking at the same situation, and he understands where he's going to go. And the British are thereby reaping 400 years of colonial dominance of India, during which they left enough of a bad taste to support all of this. And, there's a certain historic justice to all of this that plays its role also. And I find it astonishing that Americans are as blinded by their ideology that they don't see. I'm reminded, I think I spoke with you about it once before. I'm reminded of the discovery in the United States that after 2.5 years of war, Russia in Ukraine, their economy is in better shape than it was before the war started. The United States had experienced exactly that in World War II. It took a depressed economy and put it back to work in the war, discovering explosive growth. They couldn't imagine that happening in Russia, even though it had happened in the United States. That's when your ideology is blinding you. You can't see straight. You can't think correct. You make strategic mistakes of a historic nature, and you will not learn, even though I am not the only one to try to teach this lesson. I know that policymakers in the United States watch your program. You know how I know? Because they send me emails. I know them. I went to the same schools they did. So I know. They know, but they cannot break out of it. It's like watching a person so wrapped up in a way of thinking that even as it hurts them, they can't escape. There's something terribly sad about that. And that's why I opened my comments with you today by saying it's very sad. Watching Bloomberg put up that table, we're number one, is so sad. You know, you have to resort to this, playing around. My God. My statistics teacher loved to open his classes by teaching us that statistics never lie, but statisticians do.
Good point. Thank you, Richard, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Okay, same here, and I look forward to next time.